Okay, we called this a roundtable, and then when we all sat down and consulted about it, no one was quite sure what really a roundtable is, or how you structure a roundtable, or who chairs, or if anybody chairs. And so we're going to have a kind of quite loosely structured roundtable that's round-ish. And we did ask these three other people and myself to kind of conclude the day because we knew that each would have something to bring to a kind of overview of all of the quite eclectic kind of range of contributions that we've had today. And so I suppose it's by way of kind of tying it together in some ways, but also inevitably also opening up new themes and kind of new ways that we go on from now, especially for us in the context of our project. We haven't asked any of the people on the roundtable to prepare anything beyond giving themselves, just introducing themselves and kind of explaining why they're here. And Oliver is also going to introduce a project that he's involved in around queer theory, which will then hopefully open up a discussion around queer theory, picking up on some of the questions that were voiced earlier on this morning. But there'll also be space for just responding to, any kind of pressing things from you, opening out into more general discussion. So don't feel like if you want to interrupt, then interrupt. That's absolutely fine. That's very much the nature of it. And we're also hoping to kind of rein it in at some point, not to limit the conversation, but to focus on the kind of pedagogic aspects of it, because of course the Gender Knowledges Project, its ultimate aim is to turn all of these kind of activities and events in some way into teaching and learning in the form of MA, MSc modules. And so part of kind of the way I'm thinking about things is all the time thinking about how would this work as curricula, how would this work as pedagogy, what are the implications for us in thinking about turning this kind of stuff or learning from it in some way that we can build on that in terms of pedagogy. So we will, where relevant, try and draw out those particular things that are useful for the project. Okay, so I'll kick off just by introducing myself. Kath Lambert. I'm an associate professor here in the sociology department, just upstairs, is why I'm pointing upwards, not that really means anything. And my work is around education, sociology of education, but in a very broad sense. I've done work in schools, in higher education, and around political pedagogies, critical pedagogies in higher education, hence my interest in developing these modules. And I also do work on art and live art, and thinking about the kind of space and time of how live art can make certain disruptions in space and time. So I'm interested in thinking spatially and temporally about the kind of politics. And to me, pedagogy is very much about, live art is about pedagogy, our research is about pedagogy, the discussions we have, the kind of interactions we have in the corridor is as much about pedagogy in some ways as what happens in the classroom. And so when I'm thinking about pedagogy in terms of modules, I'm also drawing very widely on those kind of broader definitions of pedagogy. And I initiated a long time ago, but through discussions with many of the people in the Centre for the Study of Women and Gender here at the university, discussions about us launching some sort of interdisciplinary module, which is certainly not new. The Centre has always been interdisciplinary, and as many of you will know, there's a strong interdisciplinary tradition, particularly in women and gender. So there's very little, we use all these words like radical and innovative and new, and I'm very mindful of that. There's very little, it might be new and innovative in the particular neoliberal context that we're in, or in the particular disciplines that we're in, but there's very little that is actually kind of new or innovative or radical in a bigger sense of the term. And I think that's fine. So probably what we're doing is quite small and cautious, and with some preparations to fail along the way, and that being okay in line with queer theory. But that was what instigated the discussions around this module, and it's been great to get the funding from the university, from IATL, in order to realise that in a way that's not only been very productive, but also a huge amount of fun. So I'll leave it there, and we can come back to some of those things if they're relevant.
Yeah, this has been an amazing day in all kinds of ways that I'm still trying to process. My own sort of work has been mostly sort of departing from IR, and I say departing because I feel like I'm leading and departing in a good way, into political theory and various other forms of critical theory. At the moment, I'm quite interested in Uganda and various kinds of discussions around gender and sexuality that hover around Uganda in different ways. So, beginning with the anti-homosexuality bill and the kinds of activism that it's incited, as well as the global politics of Christianity, the Anglican Communion, evangelical Christianity. So I'm working on something at the moment that is sort of picking up on this statement that is repeated in news articles ad nauseum. Homophobia is rife in Africa. Almost every media piece you read will have this sentence in it. And I'm sort of thinking about how one deconstructs that sentence and so sort of querying geography and the geography of homophobia that's assumed in a lot of these discourses and discussions. A related piece I'm working on is about how a 19th century king in Uganda is remembered, and the kinds of, this is a king who's supposed to have had corporeal intimacy with men in his court till they were converted to Christianity, at which point they refuse the king and he has them put to death for their disloyalty, and the Catholic Church canonizes them as martyrs, and they are remembered to this day. And I'm interested in how the memory of this event sits alongside the simultaneous insistence that same-sex relations are going to happen in Uganda till the West came along. So this is really a project about memory rather than history. I'm more interested in what people think happened and in how that becomes politically consequential than in what may or may not actually have happened. And my reaction today really is about disciplines and the kinds of disciplines and disciplinary conversations that have come up today in really interesting ways. So I was really interested in 2 or 3 things. The discussion that came up on what is queer theory, and the sort of felt need for definition, which is something a lot of queer theorists are very uncomfortable about offering, because if, as a set of critical vantage points, this was meant to trouble the normal, the received, definitions in some sense consolidate and settle and make something that was troubling less troubling by confining, by drawing boundaries around. And so while queer theory is frustrating in its refusal to offer a definition, I think that it sees its critical value as being unexpected in some sense. And so how do we then work with that in pedagogy and in programs and courses that are meant to impart knowledge and that are sort of tied into this whole framework of credits and the things people are supposed to know and so forth. How does one manage that tension? I think is a big question. And just 2 smaller things that came out of specific papers. I'm quite interested in this, in thinking about interdisciplinarity. For example, I would quite like to hear more from Jude, if she's here, about what it's like to work in a business school and how that disciplinary vantage point shapes her work, if at all, and whether that offers possibilities that that we might think about. And also really incredibly impressed and moved by Caitlin's paper, which we've all been thinking about, which sort of reminded me that these endless discussions of embodiment and affect that are conducted in words, almost paradoxically against what embodiment and affect are supposed to be about. There was something really striking. It was a really striking reminder of that contradiction in a lot of the work that's going on around embodiment and affect. But that is conducted in rhetoric and discourse and non-affective registers.
Maybe just before you continue, Jude really apologized that she had to go home because her babysitter canceled. So, but she really wanted to be here.
Jude the Obscure. So I'm based at IATL, which has funded this project, so delighted to see what stage this group is at. My own disciplinary background is in theatre and performance, which you've probably guessed already. Both early modern drama and late modern dramatists such as Sarah Kane and Tony Kushner, and I mention those because they're the most obvious areas where my theatre work has crossed into the territory of queer studies. I'm working at IATL and have worked in collaboration with Kath and colleagues of Kath on the area of interdisciplinary practice at Warwick. So I'm very involved in how we might set up pedagogic mechanisms that take this kind of conversation, this kind of project, and invest it into the curriculum. there are various pedagogic ideas behind that, which I think have been exemplified beautifully today. The role of embodiment, the extent to which performance is used both as a rhetorical and analytical tool in the discourses I've been listening to, and then various bits of theoretical work. Julie Halberstein's always been mentioned, but his book, The Queer Art of Failure, is particularly interesting in this case because failure, Kath just mentioned, but failure is an object of study within the academy, and an object of study and a method for queer studies is something that would be really interesting to reflect on. The piece I was reading from earlier is E. Patrick Johnson's Introduction to Queer Theory from Cambridge Companion to Performance Studies, and within performance studies we're very invested at the moment in performances research, and if the conversation goes that way, I'm very happy to talk about method and issues of hybridizing research methodologies through performance. And to some extent that's led into a kind of transdisciplinary area of inquiry that I'm involved with at the moment, which ties, it's going to sound a bit weird, but it kind of is an ecological space. So we have recently had a research fellow work at IATL who's looking at eco-pedagogy and ways in which the sustainability of the university can be addressed, and that we think about how sustainable our discourses and our activities are. But then that got me thinking and Googling one day, and I wondered whether we might talk about queer ecology at some point, and whether queer pedagogy is radical or critical pedagogy as we understand it in the Roncierian way or in the Freirean way, or is it necessarily interdisciplinary, and is it necessarily, or does it privilege the phenomenological model? And is it, and this will be a difficult question for us as a community, ecological or not? How sustainable is the queer movement? What stage is it at in relation to the ecological movement? So that's a big bag of mess, isn't it, in terms of an introduction, but I suppose it's about queer methods and queering method, and it has one question for you all, for us all, which is, what would this M-level module entail, and how would you as a collective represent a collaborative faculty of practitioners, scholars and students, and what would a learning experience involve or look like? What would it look like if you wanted this collective material to be felt in the body of the learner? That's my question that I'd like to explore.
Hi, my name's Oliver Davis. I teach in the Department of French Studies here. I just want to tell you a little bit about a research project that I'm currently working on, and say perhaps a little bit about pedagogy and queer theory after that. The title of the project is Queer Theory in France, and what we're essentially looking at is the way in which queer theory developed, mainly in the US, by sort of cherry-picking elements from the French post-war philosophical tradition, so taking elements of Foucault, taking elements of Lacan in particular, and queering them, reading them queerly, distorting them in certain productive ways in that context, and then looking at the return movement by which that body of thought has slowly, belatedly, we talked a little bit about belatedness and the lag, but belatedly re-entered the French academic sphere and has been, I would say, resisted by French academic institutions. And I suppose I wanted to say it's been a really interesting day. I've heard lots of fascinating papers, and it's great that we are thinking about setting up this MA here. It occurs to me that it's relatively, there is a lag too, in the sense that lots of other institutions have these kinds of programs. So it occurs to me that in a sense we're more in line with the kind of French institutional temporality of this kind of institutionalization than we are the Anglo-American. That can be productive too, because I think it's an opportunity for us to think about offering something radically different rather than simply disseminating a perceived corpus of queer theory or sexuality studies or gender studies. So there's an element to that project that's kind of genealogical or cartographic. There's also an element, and I want to talk about the first workshop that we had, that in fact we weren't supposed to call a workshop, we agreed we call a symposium, which was on bareback sex. So in other words, on sexual intercourse between gay men without using condoms, so involving a risk of HIV transmission, whether that be something desired in the encounter or something fantasized or something to which there was indifference. And I think it's important for queer theory to think about those kinds of sexual practices. And what was striking in looking at the way in which queer theory has resisted engaging with those sorts of extreme, if you like, kind of dissensual manifestations of gay sexual subjectivity was the way in which in France, where there really wasn't a kind of established body of queer theory, there was nothing to contest a very forceful move to police that out of existence, to silence those practices and those practitioners and to pathologize them and from within the gay community. So there was no kind of critical queer perspective on what that kind of policing maneuver, that kind of pathologizing maneuver would involve. So that's just a little bit about that work. So there was lots of discussion about whether or not, bareback is a queer practice or not, in what sense it could be thought of as queer. I suppose what I wanted to say, there will be a publication coming out of that. I won't try and summarise it all now, but what I wanted to say is I think it's important for queer theory not to forget not to forget sex, actually, not to forget a kind of sex-positive orientation. Otherwise, I think the risk is that queer theory becomes a sort of bureaucratic exercise, a sort of policing, name-checking exercise. So I think that's all I wanted to say as a kind of opening gambit.
Thank you. Okay. Where do we go from there? Are there any initial responses to any of those things, or do any of those things resonate with other people's thoughts about the day, or contradict people's thoughts about the day?
I guess for me this day has been kind of remarkable in many ways, because we've been, as a group, we've been doing this process for a while now, and trying to see how, coming from different disciplines, what we understand on same concepts, or to what extent we can talk to each other or not. And I'm still trying to kind of work my thoughts, but I guess my question is if we want to think about it in terms of our own students, how can we create these kind of spaces that enables knowledge and methodology as well to be something that is absolutely queer, but how do we also avoid the constant naming of queer and queering, and this kind of, we're constantly trying to define things, although we constantly rejecting those definitions. And I guess my second kind of workout is, how do we bridge the gaps? I mean, I know that I had few, the papers were amazing. Some of the papers I could really relate to and understand and think through, and some of them were completely new, and I needed much more skills and knowledge and disciplinary knowledge to be able to relate to them. So how can we kind of bridge those gaps and create this kind of shared space?
Can Just a brief response. It's really interesting to hear you, and it'd be lovely to hear more from the project team about what kind of learning experience it's been for you guys. But there's something in what you're saying, there's a gap and a shared space, which is really interesting, I think, in terms of the kind of discursive elements of today. So you've created, either you're filling a gap, you've created a gap, but it's a shared gap. So there's something under what you're saying that's really very interesting, but sort of paradoxical. But the first half of what you were saying was all about this kind of incredible bringing people together and the kind of communal knowledges, and it was interdisciplinary, it was embodied. And then this second anxiety was about, but it's going to be queer, how do we make it queer? I think you just let that go. I think you just forget about that, because that's what the space is already. That's sort of, in a way, left at the door, and then the conversation begins.
But I wonder, because I was thinking when Dan was asking that question and in relation to what Oliver's just said, I wonder if it is, and I think, I'd like to think that
What,
it
a gap
is.
or a space?
No, that the queer sensibility is kind of there, because in a way, one of the things Oliver was raising was that if you don't have that kind of understanding already, then some things become unintelligible, like bareback, or there's almost something that you can't talk about in a certain way unless you have a particular framing of it. And so the questions from this morning about what is queer theory, how do we understand it, perhaps it is a necessary first step.
Yeah.
Although I'm also sympathetic to those, well, once you start pinning it down and naming it, then actually, you're almost kind of doing it a disservice, because that's against the idea of queer. But if you don't do that, otherwise you don't have that prior understanding or the sensibility or whatever it is that's in the space. How do you make it so queer that you don't need to talk about queer?
Yeah, and I think all I was getting at was, how do you stop it emerging as a sensorial object? It was starting to emerge there in the discourse around this project, that there was a kind of censoring of anything that wasn't queer. And I think that's then really the spirit of queer movements. I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but I just think that's a really important thing to think about, because student testimonies of people who are from queer departments, established queer studies programs, often talk about who's allowed in and who's not allowed in. And there's some very funny stories about, male, white, middle-class heterosexual students who wanted queer studies and their experiences of it. I mean, what a poor group that is, I've chosen that. What a shame if they have a bad time. But there is something, if you like, about policing the boundaries, which is really interesting and problematic.
In terms of Lano, can I just respond to what you're asking about, how do we bridge gaps and spaces?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, IAPTA, where Johnny comes from, and what this project is funded by, is the Institute for Advanced Teaching and Learning, which has a very strong focus on interdisciplinarity. And I'm, as a sort of favour by a crooked path from second, marking some undergraduate interdisciplinary modules. And it's been such an interesting experience to do that alongside this project, which has been really unknowing, and we haven't known particularly where we're going with it. And it seems to me that actually what happens is there's some it's a multidisciplinary course, but the students are coming from all the disciplines that the university offers, as are the lecturers, and you can see in their reflective journals or in their essays, when it's the week on the philosophy students are like this, I've never thought about it this way before, the other people are like, what is this? I don't get it, it's harder. But there's a space on the course for everybody in every discipline to have enough of a hook on it to feel comfortable, and every week as well, there are clearly spaces where people are really uncomfortable and having to work really hard. So for me, I'm now less concerned about spaces and gaps, and I think they're inevitable and necessary and really productive.
I don't want to keep banging on about language, but I just wonder if these sort of gaps between the various disciplines, the inability to some extent not to be able to speak to each other, has to do with language, and whether this course that you're sort of moving towards shouldn't at some stage, perhaps pretty early on, have some sort of linguistic elements. I mean, this is my first contact with the social sciences, but I know enough about the general subject to know that words like objectification and commodification are pretty central to, or have been pretty central to gender studies. I was quite astonished when I looked up both of these words in the OED a couple of days ago and found that neither of them has any history before the 1970s, for example. One of them was 1972, one of them was 1979. And yet the objectification, the commodification that I was talking about goes back to 5 centuries before Common Era. And it's only within the last few decades that apparently language has been found to sort of accommodate it. It was interesting, this idea of the fact that homosexuals refer to the straight. Are you straight? Well, immediately in speaking of someone as being straight, they immediately label themselves as bent. And bent is sort of distorted, deformed. So in other words, if you describe someone as straight, it means you're not straight, but you're actually labelling yourself in a pejorative way.
But in queer terms, to be bent is quite a good thing. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Niles. There is a real important attentiveness to language, what words mean, but also how those culturally kind of signify and are utilised in different disciplinary spaces. I mean, we certainly found, even amongst our relatively few disciplinary areas within the gender knowledges team, when we first started talking about themes, what one person means by agency and another person means has different resonances, subjectivity, power. These are all things that bring up, they evoke different images, they conjure different kind of methodological assumptions or epistemological assumptions. And so it's not just about the words and what the words mean and their kind of etymologies, if you like, but also how we utilise them and how we understand them across the different cultures that sometimes disciplines can be, not necessarily, but can be.
I was going to say, with no disrespect to anyone who is invested in various ways in interdisciplinarity, because we all are, because in a certain sense it's compulsory. It's been compulsory within academic institutions for 25 years. It's part of the bureaucracy of applying for grants and so on. And I think we need to think about institutionalization. Why did departments of women's studies and gender studies spring up and queer studies spring up? They didn't just spring up, to invent new forms of academic discourse and to attract new students for their own sake. There was a political motivation, a political purpose behind that, and I think we need to think about what's the kind of feed through back into the wider culture from a new program. What's distinct from other kinds of setting up another kind of new MA program or MSc program?
Yeah, I mean, that's particularly important just in the, I don't want to go off track on this, but one of the things that we talked about quite extensively at the beginning and have picked up all the way through is that there's a danger with interdisciplinarity becoming a real neoliberal project. That this is part of what the Academy wants us to do, and certain forms of interdisciplinarity tick boxes, and they sell courses and all the rest of it, and you lose the politics. And we have kind of agonised over that to a large degree, that we wouldn't get funding if this wasn't an attractive area to be, and I think it's always a tension for people working on any kind of radical, critical, political thing in the academy. To get the money, you need to be doing kind of what the system wants. But once you get the money, then potentially you can use it in different ways, and I think.
But what a lot of interdisciplinary scholars talk about is how it actually doesn't really challenge disciplinarity because it's interdisciplinary. So that's why a lot of people prefer the term transdisciplinarity, or we use that for our pedagogic text, OSO, space learning, because that suggests a genuine collaboration in that, if French studies or queer studies isn't genuinely dismantling the discipline while recreating a discipline, then it's not really French, or it's not really queer, in my view. But the point from theories of interdisciplinarity that's often made is because it's interdisciplinary, there's one discipline, there's another discipline, you're just moving between, it means between, whereas trans means across. And across or beyond is a different way of disrupting that interrelationship than inter. It actually, in ways, supports in the case of medical humanities or digital humanities, there's no question that the digital and the medical are propping up the humanities for what might be the last century of humanities life. But it's worth doing. I say as a humanities person.
There is an older way of thinking about, I mean, it wouldn't have been called interdisciplinarity, but I'm thinking about, Edward Said's position in representation of the intellectual, where he writes against specialization. And he's sort of valorizing the position of the amateur, somebody who stands outside of specialism, and by doing so is able to connect things, and by virtue of being able to connect things against the rules, is able to craft a more politically subversive position. So I think there are ways of thinking, whatever we call it, and I think what we call it is very important, but there are ways of thinking about those connections that don't play into a sort of neoliberal, this is what the academy, I mean, one might have to play that game actually to get the money, but with a sensibility that is utterly different from that.
I just want to remind people who don't know more about the project is that there is a deeply political element to this project, not just what we may or may not do with interdisciplinarity, but in our commitment to having an experiential learning aspect to the MA. And so in terms of what we're doing, and my vision of that is activism for academic credit, which you might want to find problematic as well, but it's a deeply gender and sexualities studies for the purpose of the application form, is a deeply political project which has to happen outside of the academy, and we're trying to create something that happens inside, outside, and coming back in again into the academy for our student body. That's part of what we're doing.
And gaps, physical gaps where learning might take place. Like that's a keep off the grass kind of law, but it was a gap for a protest. How does it connect? I mean, just this idea that activists, amateurs, comes back to this idea of failure. They spring from failure, or to some extent respond to failure. How does that, I don't know, but I think both of you have worked on this, how that connects to the idea of ignorance. I was thinking about the ignorance schoolmaster, but I mean, is that relevant to this discussion?
I think it is, in that it's about the status of knowledge, and so much of this comes back to, how knowledge is produced, what kinds of knowledges are generated, and the political nature of those knowledges and knowledge production. And so it absolutely is. And very briefly, the idea of the ignorant schoolmaster is a way of thinking about pedagogy that is about assuming a kind of capacity in everybody, in every learner at every level, to themselves learn to produce knowledge, to be producers of knowledge through experience, through intellectual inquiry, rather than dependent on the kind of the knowledge of the schoolmaster, of the knowing schoolmaster. And it breaks down it's name of the book by Jacques Rancière, and the idea is that it breaks down this kind of temporal idea of pedagogy as always being you're ignorant and you're learning a bit more, and then you become a bit more knowing, but you're never quite as knowing as that schoolmaster above you, or that professor, or that whatever, who always knows more. And we're always on this kind of the ladder metaphor of education that of course is very temporalised in age terms as well. So it's kind of messing with that temporality, which also has a kind of global dimension, which I think draws us back to what you were talking about this morning, thinking about how the geography of the world is also written in terms of that pedagogy of backwardness and forwardness and modernity, and thinking about these ideas of ignorance in those kind of political terms, I think is very, very important for this project and important for the activist dimensions of it. There's big ideas there, of connecting our kind of how we understand pedagogy and knowledge production in the broader sense, and that being, I suppose, the political underpinnings to the project. That I suppose at some level, I have a hope that if you hold on to those, then you do maintain some sites of contestation, but they're always going to be contested. They're always going to be dissensual and fought over. Sometimes with more success than others, I suppose.
Just as an example of one of those sites of contestation, and also in response to your comment, my friend Akshay Khanna, who many of you may know, he's a queer theorist based at IBS Sussex, runs a course called Unruly Politics, and one component of the course credit is he gets his students, he tells his students, go out and do something on Ruby. And they get full credit, right? So one year, I think this happened this year, the students basically initiated a conversation about how IDS was run. And they also hooked this conversation into the larger Occupy Sussex movement that is ongoing, I guess. And it really upset the board of IDS. There is like major, I don't know what exactly is going on, but it was successful in a way that was deeply undermining for a lot of the people running the show. So I think, you know, these when meanings sort of exceed their intentions, that's probably when something political has happened.
I hope they got a good mark. Young movement.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the piece about activism and thinking also about kind of student body and not just the side of going from the classroom to activism, thinking how we can apply it. It was definitely something that was missing for me at the Gender Institute at the LSE, of, you know, a huge lack there of connection in that space and understanding what this could be, but also thinking the reverse and you know, how activists in these spaces, I'm working actually with my teammates now on an activist project around the issues that we're doing, but thinking, you know, a lot of the activists that are thinking about these issues around gender or queer theory in spaces that don't have access or don't know. You know, we think about these spaces, like queer spaces, how do you access them? How do you know about them? And so from the reverse side of thinking, you know, that student body out there of activists, how to engage them in here, and the reverse, kind of create activists of academics, but who's doing work out there that doesn't know about this type of master's or that this could be applicable.
Yeah, which is really important, I mentioned too.
I wonder if I could, this would be changing the subject a little bit, so I'm not sure if I want to do that. I wanted to respond to Oliver's initial statement, Gambit. I found it, it really resonated with me what you said, because it seems to me that about sex positive, about queer studies needing to be sex positive, because it's, first of all, because, in the gay marriage kind of popular debates that have been happening, I feel like there's a real move away from that. There's a kind of desire to be seen as legitimate, family-like units, and to kind of normativize with, by actually moving towards kind of heteronormative, models. And also because, so I was at a conference just 2 or 3 weeks ago that was in which, so this, this very lovely, postgrad had given this paper that kind of posited about queer invisibility. And at the end, one of the kind of distinguished professor who was there kind of raised her hand and said, "Do you really think we're that invisible still?" I mean, and that really struck, it seems to me that actually, in a way it poses a big problem, because the entire kind of premise in a way of queer theory is that the queer is the other, queer is kind of invisible, and so on, and yet that's sort of not true anymore in a way. I mean, I know it's true, still is true in many ways, but it's becoming less and less true pretty quickly, I would say. I mean, I guess I'm being provocative here. Do people agree that people think I'm being obnoxious? I don't know.
I think for me, and this kind of goes back to epistemology and what for me is kind of what I would like to see the students, what kind of space they're engaged with, is for me a queer theory or a queer approach would not be looking at the queer subject in the traditional way of the queer subject, but this constant asking of who is invisible and who is silenced. So it's this constant search for the subaltern. And I think this is for me what I would like to see the students the kind of thinking that they take. And actually, this year I've been teaching in 2 different places, and I was quite struck by the way in which you would think that students are equipped with the whole notion of difference and race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, and so on. But actually they're not very trained in looking and understanding the world in this way. And in a way we keep jumping forward. And I think the idea, the queer bit of it, is giving them that approach of constantly asking who is first. And especially, and that kind of links to some of the things that you were talking about, is that we're here based in what used to be the British Empire. And this kind of having this course here, my experience of my master's was, oh my God, I'm in what was British Empire without talking about empire and colonialism, but studying development. So it's not only the disciplinary epistemology, but also kind of the violence that exists in epistemology and disciplines and so on, that also I would like the students to constantly kind of reflect on. And the question of how do we create a space which is not white dominated, not that there's something wrong with that, we can start saying that, but that actually can incorporate also in terms of what kind of readings we give and what kinds of, I know that it sounds as if it is something that is taken for granted, but the amount of times that you look at reading lists and syllabuses of courses, and you look at the reading, and for me this is why Alia's paper kind of struck me. I was like, I can actually see Leila Bulurod, I can see Spivak, I can see so many others, that you can have whole reading lists without seeing those people in gender and sexuality. So it's, I'm sorry, it wasn't fair here.
No, it was important, and it reminded me that one of the things I was thinking about when I was talking this morning was around the activism and the dangers of gender and LGBT activism becoming this kind of missionary activism. And we have talked quite a bit about that, not just in terms of sexuality politics, but in terms of the politics of who's located where more generally, of going out from the university and doing activism, whether it's local or international, is it can be problematic, and the kind of literatures that we've been looking on around service learning and research-based learning, and they have quite problematic dimensions that really need working through in terms of power inequalities and positionality, and so I think it's an important point that is about kind of epistemology and knowledge, and it is also about the acts of activism and what that means.
I was just thinking in response to your question, I mean, I think that wasn't actually changing the subject. It comes back to this idea of what is queer and what is queer theory about. And I would simply say that what is queer in one moment needn't be in another. So when particular kinds of subjects, just as Lana was saying, become hyper-visible, or visible in a newly hegemonic sense, they are simply no longer queer. And this sort of goes back to, I think it was David Halperin, right, who said queer is not a positivity, it's a positionality. So we're always asking queer in relation to what? In the same way that, I don't think there is a subaltern subject. I think there is always only a relation of subalternity. And who or what is subaltern is always a contextual framing or description. It's not a label that one applies onto things or people in a contextless way. And just also to reiterate Lana's point about, I think we need to pay attention to place, and maybe this intersects also with language, the point about language, and with your own project, the way in which it's tracking how ideas travel and the very specific context of production and reception and translation and mistranslation. And paying attention to place, I think, also means that we have to think about so much of queer theory comes out of Anglo-America and is sort of just being applied to other places, which is a tired circuit of knowledge production, and we have to think about how other places generate theory. Whether we call it queer or not really doesn't matter that much, but how phenomena, things that are happening in other places might generate theory in their own right, and how that might be useful not just there but everywhere. So it's sort of much more multi-directional circuits of production and conversation.
And I think your story really perfectly illustrates actually the exact point you've made, which is it was the professor who said that to the new student after we already visible. It's like, yeah, you are, but maybe you're done, sort of thing. So maybe it's not the professors and the people who are instituted in these buildings who should be doing the teaching and the deciding of the course, but the students get to inform and co-write maybe some of the aspects of the course and hit the agendas rather. You know, so we have people with your experiences, for example, who come and say, well, this is what I need on the reading list. I've heard about these things or these issues. Can we do that, please?
Before I came here today, the word queer meant homosexual. Since coming here today, I now know that it's far too narrow, and I now begin to understand it in a wider context. So, if that counts for anything, this meeting has had some benefit for me as well.
There's a really interesting book in early modern studies, although it's about contemporary productions of Shakespeare, but it's a book called Shakespeare's Queer Children, which is quite interesting. I was just going to say, pick up on exactly what you said, which is why I think that an ecological way of thinking might be more relevant, and thinkers like Gregory Bates and his Steps Towards Ecology of Mind from 1972 suggests a kind of almost cybernetic model where, as you just articulated so well, it's a relationship of sub-quality rather than the sub-quantum subject, about the interrelation. And Bateson's view is that the organism cannot be separated from the environment, right? So it's a useful interdisciplinary theory for all disciplines, but I think it might be particularly useful for anthropologists, sociologists, people invested in the notion of the subject within its environment. But the idea of relationship is terribly important in moving towards a more ecological way of thinking. I think that's what I was getting at earlier.
It seems to me there's a whole kind of list of really interesting, provocative questions that come out of this that certainly for me now feel really helpful. You know, at least in knowing what we need to attend to.
I'd just like one more. I mean, I teach elite global students, and the idea, you know, University of Warwick and its positionality is not one that we can forget. Like again, it's back to, you know, I'm seeing one of the issues that I work in law school, but teach courses on gender and development and so on. But you know, you're seeing the people that by definition are here are the global elites, aren't they? And so I think that in itself makes it quite challenging. And I really like the idea of the Unruly Project. But you know, I really like that idea of engagement of the unruliness, which perhaps we need to destabilise a lot of perceptions. So what's I think great, the student, but you know, again, it's all about positionality and what knowledge is privileged and what isn't. And maybe beyond that is quite a challenge pedagogically, really.
It's a real challenge pedagogically, and it's a reminder that, I mean, one of the things that this has come out of, I think, is quite classic feminist concerns with accountability and positionality, and Adrienne Rich's kind of reminder that, you know, that you have to account for your privilege, and that affects the kinds of knowledge that you can produce, and any claims to accountable knowledge have to be, you know, located in your place, your multiple kinds of identities, and that has to be a kind of starting point for knowledge production, no matter how it's done. You know, whatever the kind of pedagogic methods are, that there has to be a kind of strong theoretical underpinning to it. I guess that would be my touchstone, because you can't wish away those things. That is what we're doing. And so, you know, we have to work within that and be problematising it, but not in such a way that then you can't do anything, because that can happen as well.
But there might be different categories of risk, and accountability, the unruly project in law or medical school
Yeah.
might be more
Or for different
dangerous
people,
than
yeah.
the unruly project in the arts and humanities. Do you see what I mean? So it's about. But that's a great question.
Yes, it is a great question.
You know, because I do
How
work
far
with the
can one
medical
be
school,
unruly?
and so right, we're going to do the unruly project next week, Monday morning in hospital.
You need to
Not
do
sure
risk
how big
assessment for that.
But you think there's room for this unruly behaviour
Yeah,
in
you
law?
could be unruly in the medical. You could actually send people out to poor areas, you know, and not
They do,
medical
they
art.
do.
Well, I'm sure they do, but you know, I mean, you know, you could actually see what life's like in upstream determinants, can you? Rather than, I mean, I don't know. I mean, an unruly project in law are quite possible.
Yeah, and presumably dealing with unruliness is a key skill of the lawyers.
Yeah, but just close it down. But I mean, yeah, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
Yes,
quite
flip it
nice.
around.
Flip it around. Great.
Yeah, I feel an unruliness coming into the title somewhere.
Yes, yes, I think we should be more unruly.
An MA in unruliness.
I like it.
Are there any other comments or things people want to raise before I draw us to a close? No. I'd like to do two little plugs before you all go. We have an event. This is the end of this kind of stage of our project really, where we're all working as a team. And everybody's kind of going off for the summer, and then it'll be my job and those of us that are left here to try and kind of turn this into something. I'm not quite sure how that stage is going to work, but before we finish, we've got two more events. This Friday, Science, Scientists and Feminism, where we have a number of scientists, feminist scientists coming in and talking about their own practice. Very, very interesting. I think it'll be quite different to a lot of the stuff that we've done before and challenging in different ways. So please do come along to that just for a couple of hours in the afternoon, 3 till 5 o'clock in Wolfston on Friday. Not the best time, I know, but and then on Monday, for something completely different, the Queer Salon will be all day at the Reinvention Centre over on Westwood Campus. Feel free to drop in any time during the day at all. There'll be cakes and tea and coffee, music, films, a Polari section, the kind of queer, anarchic, unruly language of Polari. We're doing a little bit of play around that Polari Scrabble and a little bit of Polari artwork. And most importantly, the rather wonderful open barbers who cut the hair of all genders and sexualities are coming up from London, and they cut great hair. I can vouch for that from my personal experience. Not this one, but first on the next.
If I turn up, it'd be very queer. I'll turn up and get barbered.
But they cut hair for free, and the politics is around whether they do it at their salon in London. It's about what you can pay, but at gigs like this, it's about in return for conversation or silence if you'd rather have silence, because that is also meaningful. But the whole idea is about a different kind of exchange, and we're quite interested in the sort of pedagogy of that particular exchange. And so do come and have a free haircut and hang out in our queer salon. There'll be lots of readings as well. We've got a closet which will have lots of nice queer readings in, so you can come and take your pick and hang out with the beanbags and
What
chat
are they
to
called, the
people.
ones with the hair?
Open barbers.
Open barbers.
Yeah. If you have a look on our website, there's a blog about them with lots of links with a bit of video and some stuff about
I
them.
don't know if I will be able to come, but are they usually ever in London?
Yeah, they are. They have a salon in London. Have a look at their website. They're in London all the time. So yeah, please do come along and spread the word about that, because we do want, it's not a great place for people just dropping by. And if there's undergrads that are kind of, got nothing better to do, or your friends and family, it's absolutely open to absolutely anybody who wants to come. And they're very child friendly too. I can vouch for that. So please do come to those. So the only thing left for me to do is to thank everybody. I'd really like to thank Lana and Emma, who've done a lot of the work organising today, and Sam. And all of the speakers, of course, particularly Raoul, everybody who's come and given the paper, we really appreciate it. It's been a really, really important day, I think, for consolidating and exploring a lot of things on our project. So thanks very much, and thanks to all our panel as well.